And thanks everyone for taking the time out of your schedule to join us today for this webinar. So I'm going to kick things off by taking a pretty high view, kind of 10,000 foot view of talking about the Guild Southeast program, who we are as an organization, and then diving into this topic of ecological forestry and mountain cove forests. And I'm going to focus just on kind of big picture stuff around the forest conservation values and silviculture and ecology associated with some of these sites, and then punt to Dr. Jeff Stringer, who's with us, to dive more in depth into the forest operations and management options that come along with thinking about getting stuff done on the ground in these forests. So, like Dakota mentioned, my name is Nick B. Miller. I'm the Southeast Region Director for the Forest Stewards Guild. I have a background in field forestry and applied ecosystem restoration. Have my bachelor's and my master's in forestry, so I'm trained as a forester and have background as a professional forester, and these days manage the Guild's Southeast program based out of Asheville, North Carolina. So really excited to be with you all today. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the Guild as an organization, and for those of you who attended our Bottomland Hardwood webinar last week, I apologize, some of these beginning slides are going to be a bit redundant. But for those of you who did not attend that, it might be less familiar with us. The Forest Stewards Guild is a national nonprofit organization. Our mission is to practice and promote forestry that sustains the integrity of forest ecosystems and supports human communities. So really both social and ecological in its scope, and really taking a holistic approach to managing the diverse social, environmental, and economic factors of our forests. We achieve that mission through a variety of different means that includes education, training, policy analysis, research, to some degree advocacy, and increasingly more boots on the ground action, working across the country with local practitioners and partners to implement meaningful projects that have real positive conservation impact in the places that we work. We're somewhat of a unique organization in that we both have program staff, such as Dakota and myself, and others working out of different field offices around the country to fulfill our mission. But we also have a membership program of both professional members and affiliate members. And so as a member of the Forest Stewards Guild, you adopt a series of guiding forest stewardship principles that help shape your approach to forest management. The most important, perhaps, of which is what we call the first duty principle, which says that your first duty as a forester or as a forest landowner is to forests and their future. So we hold the profession of forestry to a very high forest stewardship ethic. And so in the Southeast, we're doing a variety of different things that fall under these four major programmatic areas. First is sustainable biomass and sustainable supply chains. We're working with a variety of different entities to connect responsible wood product sourcing to positive conservation impact on the ground. We're working on some innovative collaborative forest restoration activities that are really place-based in Western North Carolina to try and crack the nut of increasing resources for private landowners to control invasive exotic plants, especially in the context of managing cove forests. We're working to restore shortleaf pine ecosystems, focusing on the Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee and Kentucky, and really trying to increase capacity for prescribed fire in that geography. And lastly, the Guild has been working to help define and disseminate a model of ecological forestry in bottomland hardwood forests, really across the South. And we have projects going on now from the lower Mississippi Valley to the Atlantic Coastal Plain. And so the Guild has always had a presence in the Southeast, but it's really grown a lot in the past couple years. And so what does it mean when we say this term ecological forestry? Our current executive director, Dr. Xander Evans, summarized a series of consistent themes in the literature that relate to ecological forestry in a white paper he produced back in 2006. And so some of the emergent themes include that forests have intrinsic value, Humans need to extract products from the forest. Silviculture should follow natural processes, so really mimicking natural disturbance patterns. Foresters should plan for the long term, really thinking about long-term sustainability. While we're trained as foresters to think on the stand scale, we also need to be balancing that with the larger ecosystem. So, thinking about the landscape scale context of our management. The social and economic context really matters, and an appreciation for that science and place-based experience should guide forestry. And I think this is really key to the membership of the Guild and an appreciation for the knowledge of boots on the ground practitioners. And so to many folks, that are out, managing forests every day, this idea of ecological forestry is really synonymous with just good forestry, with the application of responsible forest management and silviculture. And there's a lot of different themes and terms that have been used in the literature and also in practice that really get at a similar approach to management. In my opinion, ecological forestry is perhaps best understood as our attempt to better integrate the science of ecology with the practice of scientific forestry. So trying to better bring together those two disciplines. And so pivoting to the Appalachian context and looking at the kind of socio-demographic environment of the central and southern Appalachians, we know that family forest owners or non-corporate private landowners own almost half of the forest land in Appalachia. We also know, based on broader regional data sets, that the majority, 88% of forest landowners in the South don't have a written forest management plan, and the majority are considered underserved, as evident by low adoption rates of things like government cost share programs and different tax incentive programs. We also know, based on social surveys, that family forest owners in the region primarily own their forest land for the non-market values associated with it. So beauty or scenery, biological diversity, water resources, and especially important, wildlife habitat. And so this information suggests to me that there is a huge opportunity for more strategic outreach to family forest owners in our region, and that ecological forestry is really compatible with the goals of family forest owners in our region, and can be used as a tool for helping meet their goals, but also achieving broader conservation impact. And so Appalachian forests are really some of the most biologically diverse temperate forests in the world, second only to some regions of central China, some temperate regions of central China. We contain the world's highest salamander diversity. We have an exceptionally high amount of rare plants in our forests, and our forests support the highest number of terrestrial snails in the United States, among many other things. We also have very high tree species diversity in our Appalachian forests, the highest in North America, and also the highest amount of endemic flora and fauna. Aquatic species diversity is also exceptionally high in the streams that exist in our forested landscapes, where we have 66 plus different at-risk species and over 20 different federally listed threatened and endangered species that exist in our aquatic habitats. This is especially true for mountain cove forests that, especially rich cove forests, are some of our most productive soils and sites that we have in the Appalachian region, and support a really high amount of biological diversity and also a high amount of timber productivity. We also have a high diversity of different natural communities and forest types in our region. And the different potential for a site to support a different forest condition and forest type is largely driven by different abiotic factors, including elevation, aspect, landform or position, and soil moisture and soil type. And so based on some modeling done by Stephen Simone back in 2005, we can actually map and understand these different ecological zones and their potential vegetative conditions on the landscape. And so for the sake of thinking about the talk today and thinking about silviculture and mountain cove forests, we're really keying into the acidic cove forests and the rich coves as the two major subtypes for mountain cove forests. And so when we think about the application of ecological forestry in mountain cove forests, again, one of the core kind of principles here is on mimicking natural disturbance patterns. The evidence suggests that these types of cove sites have actually been impacted relatively infrequently by fire compared to some of the mountain oak forests that we have in our region, and that cove sites are more driven by wind and ice storm events, which typically create smaller canopy gaps and single tree and small group gaps in the form of around 1/8 of an acre on average, with more rare, larger 15 to 20 acre kind of stand replacing windblown gaps that occur occasionally. And so, when we think about silviculture, that largely means uneven age selection silviculture as a way to really mimic some of those canopy gap disturbance patterns and increase the diversity and resilience of these forest types overall. And when I say diversity, I mean diversity in the broad sense of the word, to include structure, age classes, diameter distribution, and species composition. One of the groups of wildlife species that really benefit from this type of uneven age management are forest interior birds that really benefit from later successional closed canopy habitat conditions. And so we can use silviculture and forest management to either maintain those that ecological integrity of those disturbance patterns, or take a younger forest and accelerate the stand successional trajectory to achieve later successional habitat conditions faster. And so we need to understand as well the landscape scale needs, and that some of the uneven age silviculture options might not be enough in terms of getting the habitat that we need, especially for certain at-risk wildlife that really depend on young forest conditions. And so some of these infrequent, historically, but valuable things that happen of stand replacing larger events and patch cuts and other even age management approaches also have a role when you think about the wildlife needs and the landscape needs of the region. And so just to dive a little bit deeper into the two major subtypes for cove forests, acidic cove forests and rich cove forests. Acidic cove sites are largely differentiated by having more acidic, lower pH soils than rich cove forests, and typically occur near kind of low base, low pH granitic rock underlying geology, and have a canopy that's dominated by poplar, birch, buckeye, red oak, chestnut oak, with some degree of magnolia and eastern hemlock throughout. And so promotes generally more acid tolerant trees. These sites are also characterized as typically having a pretty dense shrub layer of evergreen shrubs that are also acid tolerant, such as rhododendron, mountain laurel, and dog hobble. Typically, the herbaceous layer of acidic coves is pretty low density with really scattered occurrences of different vascular plants, and the elevation gradient is about 2,000 to 4,500 feet. The second major kind of subtype that I'll talk about are rich cove forests. And so these sites typically have a higher pH and really occur on some of our more sweet soils, more high productivity sites in the region. And so the canopy here trends towards supporting dominant tree species such as poplar, basswood, white ash, cucumber tree, birch, silverbell, and black cherry are all prevalent trees on these sites. Sugar maple on certain sites as well. And so the shrub layer on these types of forests is typically a lot more open, lower cover of shrubs with dominant shrub species, including spice bush, hydrangea, and sweet shrub. And also in terms of the herbaceous layer, these forest types have the greatest diversity out of any of our natural communities in the Southern Appalachians, with over 135 different herb species. So that includes pretty well-known things like ginseng and cohosh and rattlesnake ferns being kind of common herbaceous plants. The elevation occurs within the same range of 2,000 to 4,500 as our acidic cove sites as well. And so I think it's important to think about, thinking about ecological forestry and natural disturbance regimes. It's important to recognize that we really have a shifting baseline and changes in disturbance over time. In addition to wind and ice events, we also have anthropogenic disturbances and the role of past land use and how that has influenced the structure and composition of our cove forests. So, the degree to which Native American use and early Euro-American agriculture and grazing practices has really helped shape the current conditions as we see them today. Also, with climate change, we're expecting to see an increase in the frequency and severity of drought, as well as increased wildfire occurrence. And so what do those changing base conditions mean for how we understand disturbance ecology in mountain oak forests? And can we expect to see fire begin to play more of an important role in these forests over time? Also, invasive exotic plants, pests, and pathogens are an increasing change to the way that we think about disturbance in the context of cove forests, especially hemlock woolly adelgid, which can really change the composition and structure of a lot of these cove sites where hemlock is a component of the stand. And so thinking forward, pre-Euro-American disturbance isn't necessarily the silver bullet as being the best basis for making future decisions. And we really have to think holistically about how we can focus on increasing resiliency and adaptation of our forests and the way we manage them moving forward. And so that's all I have. Thanks everyone for your time. And with this, I will hand it off to the next presenter.
Great. Thanks, Nick. And thanks everyone who joined us during that. Up next, we have Dr. Jeff Stringer. Dr. Stringer has been actively engaged in upland hardwood silviculture and forest operations, research, and continuing education for the last 35 years. He has served on several National Forest Stewardship Council and Controlled Wood working groups, and is currently the operational director of the Center for Forest and Wood Certification, providing solutions for certification issues in the Eastern U.S. So we're really excited to hear from him today. Whenever you're ready, Jeff, we are ready for you.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate everybody being on board. And so we're going to spend some time looking at management and operations in the cove sites. We did a great job of, Nick did a really good job of giving us a general understanding of what they were. I'm going to focus a little bit about what's going on in a particular physiographic region where the cove sites are particularly important and particularly difficult to deal with. And hopefully the information I'm going to be presenting you will be applicable, or some of it certainly will be applicable throughout the broader region. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I believe, do we have that? Everybody got it?
Yep, looks good.
Yep, got it. Okay. All right. So we're going to deal with cove sites, and we're talking about in the mountains and mesophytic cove sites that are in the Appalachian and Cumberland plateaus as well. We're going to talk about a little bit about the physiographic considerations, some terminology, anthropogenic disturbance, which we touched on. Nick did just briefly, and I want to spend a little bit more time on it, but we'll spend most of our time on dealing with operations and management, dealing with road access, site disturbance, the importance of the hydrological network and water quality management, and protection of other attributes associated with cove sites. And so here, everybody should be familiar with this common physiographic regions here. And of course, we're dealing with the Appalachian and the Allegheny Mountains and the associated physiographic regions. Here's just a close-up of the Cumberland Mountains, Appalachian Mountains, and their associated plateaus. And you can see, of course, this extends all the way from northern Alabama and the mountain system up into the northeast. My experience is in this area right here in eastern Kentucky. It's the interior rugged section of the Cumberland Plateau, a little bit different, more highly dissected than what is south into northern Alabama, for example. And this is what it looks like. So here we have lots of cove sites, highly dissected topography, very steep slopes. The slopes often have more steepness than in the Appalachian Mountains proper. Obviously, slope length is not near as much. Here, we've got situations of slope lengths between 1,000 and 1,500 foot. But you can see the dissected nature of this. And so I'm going to spend my bulk of my presentation in dealing with mesophytic coves, and these are those, biologically diverse cove sites. In this case, the examples I'm going to provide are from the Cumberland Plateau, and you can see the topo map there, or how we've got several cove sites that we're looking at. We're going to zoom in and use one of these as an example, if you will, and moving through this presentation. But these are structures that are, sheltered, usually highly productive landscape positions, generally concave sloped, all of them involving headwaters, and often sometimes anyway, very restricted access at the stream level to get in and out of these things. Okay, and here's just a picture of what that can look like, where you've got a stream first order flowing out of a Cumberland Plateau into a rugged cove site, and you can see the restricted nature of that, which certainly causes problems with access, and we'll deal more with that. And I'll mention real quick an issue of terminology, if you will. We're talking about cove sites in general. I've been talking a little bit about the mesophytic cove sites, the higher productivity ones, and then we've got this thing called the mixed mesophytic cove stands. And this is probably a lot of you that work in the region understand what I'm talking about here. And there is sometimes some confusion about what's going on. And so that's why I want to spend a little bit of time on terminology, because these mixed mesophytic cove stands are extremely biologically diverse, floristically diverse, and they involve a assembly described by Lucy Braun. And these things are considered HCVs for FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, FM management. And they are defined as stands having a preponderance of a diverse overstory. You can see the list there: yellow buckeye, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a forest that still maintains this species composition, or the majority of these species, as overstory species. Good chance it's old growth at this point, because most of these cove sites that had that original biodiversity in them have been altered through anthropogenic disturbance over the last several hundred years. So these are very rare to find. Okay, so these mixed mesophytic cove stands have been referred to erroneously, and I'm one of the culprits in that, of treating them, or I guess the terminology used as a mesophytic cove site. Well, that's actually not true, because these stands are typified by this unique diversity. And we have, of course, many cove sites in Appalachia which don't contain this anymore. Okay, and very few of these coves nowadays, would be classified as high conservation values because of that loss of diversity. And that loss of diversity is, of course, due to us. Okay, Native Americans. We'll talk a little bit about that for a minute, and then I want to spend just a short amount of time on settlement and post-settlement. Because those disturbances were pretty significant, leading to wholesale changes, and a lot of them very predictable in the type of floristic communities we have now and have to deal with. So Native Americans, we know, generally recognized as operating in the region for the last 3,000 years, probably more than that. We have evidence of going back at least that far. A lot of that disturbance was certainly unquantified, largely unknown. We talked earlier about fire. Probably had little effect, particularly on mesophytic cove sites. In general, probably didn't have a lot of effect in cove sites. Obviously there was a lot of hunting being done in places there was agrarian societies were developed. But the biggest impact that occurred to many of our cove sites were due to the settlement, European settlement, and what happened directly thereafter. So somewhere around 1700s through mid 1800s, and these dates will vary depending upon where you're at in the fairly large region we're talking about here, north to south, but you get the idea. So during that period of time, there was a lot of subsistence homesteading, small scale tree cutting, very small scale logging, and of course farming. And in the case of the Cumberland Plateaus, and in the case of Appalachian proper, a lot of times these cove sites were targeted because in some cases of the higher productivity soils that were there. And so there was a lot of farming, which was, of course, not an ecologically sound forest management tool that went on. And of course, all of that environment that was cleared and whatever at one time have certainly come back. This is a picture of what once was a cornfield at the turn of the century. And you can see the number of straight stems that are in it now. So that's a predominantly yellow poplar cucumber stand now. Very typical of certainly the Appalachian Plateau, the southern Appalachians in general. You can see this all the time, okay? And farming had its effects on our cove sites. And we have done research on that. And this, there was a really good paper on this, and it's at the bottom of the screen by Kalis in '86, Soil Properties of Steep Appalachian Old Fields in Ecology. And that's a good reference if you want to know the what happened to those sites from a soil standpoint with that kind of, with that agrarian use of these sites. And of course, the biggest thing there was you had a significant change in floristic composition. The loss of the Brownian diversity because of the clearing and that kind of thing. In some cases, to near monocultures, yellow poplar and associated co-occurring species. I mentioned cucumber, okay? And so that was a significant impact that greatly affected, obviously, the floristic composition of these sites. And lost some topsoil and all that, about an inch, because what that did is increase your coarse fragments in the upper part of the soil. It changed the chemistry a little bit, but that's been so long ago in many cases that most of the calcium, the pH, and all that kind of stuff has recovered from that. And where it's yellow poplar dominates, these actually have higher calcium and higher pH than what would normally be established there, just because of the nutrient cycling associated with those species. So those are pretty dramatic changes that occurred. And of course, then we have the period of 1840-ish, so mid-1800s to early 1900s, where we really did a job on altering the landscape. And of course, the advent of the steam locomotive opened up the region, as it did a lot of the US, to facilitate harvesting. We had iron furnaces going on and tanneries, all that, and we had continued homesteading and farming. So we had all those activities going on. This picture is a narrow gauge rail steam locomotive hauling timber out of one of the sites in the Cumberland Plateau. And this is what opened up, this kind of technology is what opened up the large scale logging that occurred throughout the region, okay? And so just a couple pictures, we got a picture on the left there. Somebody's fixing to die here in a minute. So I'm sure they'll call 911. The picture on the right, I really like it because if you look closely, what you see is, first of all, a broken up canopy. So the picture on the left shows functional clear cut, if you will, right? And the picture on the right shows a more broken up canopy of selective logging. And back then, they had the commercial species. American chestnut was not very, didn't command a high value, and they left a lot of it. Of course, it subsequently, a couple tens of years later, it died. But that picture is really good right there if you look at it, because it's got selectively cut forest. It's got a railroad track going, meandering up through it, narrow gauge railroad track, and a homestead there. So that kind of typifies what life was like back then. And of course, all that recovered. There was a period of regional regrowth. I show this one picture right here, this very large tree. Of course, it's hard for us to tell what the species is, looking at it like this, but this was the last large white oak in the part of the Kentucky that I circled on my map earlier. And they got that thing in 1941, Hatter Logging Company did, it actually made the papers, But the region has been regrowing, obviously. And of course, in some parts of the region, and particularly the part that I deal with, you got this going on, not too ecologically sound management happening there. So there's been a lot going on in the region, and that affects, certainly the forests that we have to work with, things we have to deal with. So let's focus a little bit now on operations and management. And I'm gonna stay focused on what I know best about, which is road access, site disturbance issues, maintenance of the hydrologic network and water quality management, and protection of historical attributes. And we'll talk more about those here in a few minutes, okay? So what I'm gonna use is an example, and I hope this is a good way to do it, but I picked out a Cove site that I'm familiar with. We manage a lot and have been for a long time. Very typical of a lot of Cove sites in the region. and I think you'll see that. And while this may not be exactly like as high elevation as some of you may deal with in the Appalachians proper, there's still some common themes that are associated with the management of these areas. And so I'll pick out, there's 3 cove sites here. I just labeled them A, B, and C, and I've done so so that you can see them in real life. So the three separate cove sites, very constricted at the outflow of them, spreading out as you go up slope. These are facing 2 of them north and northeast, so real high productivity site. The other one is east and has southern elements to it. So I'm going to take one of these, Cove B, and I'll blow it up a little bit. And what I've done is I just ran just a hand boundary around that so you could see it a little better. You'll notice in the left-hand photo, from the standpoint of in that topo map, there was no solid blue line there. Well, that's not uncommon. There is a perennial stream at the bottom of this watershed B. In the interior rugged section of the Cumberland Plateau, if you got about 30 to 35 acres, you will generate the initiation of a first order perennial stream. So there is a stream that comes up the bottom of these, very narrow down there. And then of course, there's a highly dendritic nature associated with overland flow. And the dashed lines here show that, and that is the ephemeral channel patterning, okay, that ultimately, drains down into surface waters that emerge during high precipitation events that of course then flow into the perennial stream below, okay? So if you're going to manage these sites, this hydrologic network is really critical, and trying to maintain water quality associated with the use of these sites and the operations in these sites can be dicey at best, okay? So ephemeral channels, people sometimes are referred to as ephemeral streams. These are just places that water is pushed out. Once pore pressures get to the point during a heavy rain, you get overland flow. And as soon as the rainfall stops, the soils drain out, they dry up. There's a very small one that's draining directly into a perennial stream. So sometimes these things can be very small in nature. They are very evident because they do have rock bottoms and that kind of thing where the bedrock is exposed, or gravel and materials exposed. But they also can be pretty big. This is an ephemeral channel, and you can look at the size of the drainage that's going on here and the slopes going down to it and that kind of thing. So these ephemeral channels pose some difficult problems for forest operations. So access is a big problem in coves sometimes. The smaller the cove, the harder it is to deal with. This is a particularly small cove, about 40 acres in size, and it's very hard to deal with from the standpoint of access, okay? Trying to get in and out the bottom is difficult. Larger coves, have wider mouths to them and stuff, not as big of an issue, but it can be, anytime you're working down at the stream course, it's always a problem. So in this case, when we access this, we had to access it, we had to punch a forest road through it, okay? And we did so by avoiding the ephemeral channel network, because as soon as you bisect that, you've got your source of mud, which is a road, right, directly connected to, part of your hydrologic network, and that's never going to be a good thing. So in this case, we punched the road in high to keep it out of the network, and and so this is the best thing you can do from the standpoint of of access, is staying away from this ephemeral channel system, and certainly the perennial stream and that kind of thing. Obviously, there are times where you can't do that, and elevated crossings should be maintained both on ephemeral channels, as well as the intermittent and first order or perennial channels that flow out of here, okay? Now then you've got to deal with water control issues that are associated with these things, okay? And so when you put your water control on your structure, whatever it is, you want to do it in a way that considers where the ephemeral channel network is at, okay? And the idea here, we put water control structures in with the idea that we would get the off-slope drainage and downslope drainage in between the ephemeral channel network, so that the sediment path that would flow from this naturally would dissipate prior to coming in contact with the hydrologic network of the ephemeral channels over there. And we generally did a pretty good job, and we did space these in according what our normal best management practice, state guidelines would say, that kind of thing. We wound up in trouble with this one right here, I've highlighted in red. There was an accumulation of water there which led to downslope movement and contact with the ephemeral channel network. And the reason it did was, if you'll notice real close on this topographic map and the way that road lays in there, it was actually getting that particular water control structure was funneling water from 2 directions to that point. And it was doing so on the cut bank side of it. We had a culvert put in there, and that was channeling too much water in that one particular spot. And here's that road that's going through this cove site. Notice it's dominated by yellow poplar. The low point was right here. And of course we had water coming on the cut channel, the cut bank side of this thing, and then channeled through a culvert and then flowing downhill. And what that did was it cut a trench. So we put our man-made ditch in there because of this exacerbated flow we had that ultimately led to the contamination of the stream below with sediment through the ephemeral channels. So what we did was we basically put 2 water control structures on either side to capture that water, and that limited its flow down the slope and solved that problem. So and it was just an issue on my part where I wasn't paying good attention, putting my water control structures in according to BMP specs, and I got it wrong. And so you have to be careful about your water control placement, because you can pitch water, especially in a more mesic situation, quite a distance downhill. And if you don't have that placement right, it can definitely cause you problems, okay? Now, one other thing that we have played with that could help you for mitigating water quality problems in these cove sites is the extension of the SMZs, or streamside management zones, or riparian management zones, whatever you want to call them, of whatever specification you use them. But extending those up into ephemeral channels may help some sites with some attributes. And here's just a good example where there's a complete clear cut done in a cove site, and we extended the streamside management zone for a perennial stream up into the ephemeral channels to take care of some issues, not just water quality in this case. So that's something that could be done that might be particularly useful in these sites, realizing that you're leaving timber there if you ever wanted to cut this heavy. Now this was done in this particular, I don't recommend doing what you're looking at there. This was done for research purposes, but it was one I could show a streamside management zone to you pretty easily with, okay? So we're back to our site again, and one of the other things from a sustainable forest management standpoint is the identification and protection of historic and archaeological attributes. And our cove sites, depending upon where you're at regionally, did get some use from farming and homesteading because they were more, in this case, more highly productive soils. So on this particular site, there were 4 rock piles that were attributes associated with the farming. When they farmed it, they put the plow down and it jumped all around, and they moved. If a boulder was too big to move, they didn't move it. If it was too small to fool with, they didn't fool with it. And but they did pile up rocks that you could, of the size you could pick up and move and pile them. And they're an historic artifact now. The other artifact we had, which is very common, is either sled paths where the farmers came up in, or old logging, paths where the historic narrow gauge rail was in at. So that's what a rock pile looks like. You can see the rock. These are just a round pile of rocks that you'll find out there in these cove sites where they've been farmed. You can see the size of the material in there, and they're a historic attribute at this point. We just flag them out so we know where we're at, so we don't disturb them. And this is what that trail going up into that cove site looks like. So this is from the old narrow gauge rail. They punched it up into the hill a little bit into that cove site. And of course, that's an historical attribute as well. Now, there are times where you can still find things like this sitting around, and that's an old coarse cross tie for that narrow gauge rail system. And we treat those as historic, attributes that we maintain and protect as we manage these areas. And obviously, there's archaeological sites. This is a rock shelter. You can find chert. Where these bigger ones like this are often called chert factories, where over time Native Americans worked chert in it, and you can find remnants of that. Occasionally you can find things like petroglyphs. I don't know whether you can see it or not, but this was a carved out turkey imprint in this rock, you cannot put a circle around it. So these things are scattered throughout Appalachia. You know, they're not cove sites are the only place they're found, but you will find some of this that you need to pay attention to and protect, okay? Now, the biggest thing we have to deal with, I think, the water quality stuff can be dealt with fairly easily, but mitigating floristic disturbance is a huge issue from the standpoint of management operations. And harvest disturbance to the duff layer is probably a biggest culprit as any. And if you've already got yellow poplar around, it's a great way to perpetuate disturbing the duff layer and get some light on the sides. A great way to perpetuate yellow poplar. Nothing wrong with yellow poplar. However, if you're trying to build back the ecological diversity and floristic and overstory tree diversity of these sites, opening them up and doing a lot of duff layer disturbance is problematic. Now, we have done operational research in this, and there are ways to mitigate that kind of thing, and particularly in relation to yellow poplar establishment, okay? And the way we've done that is by changing the patterning of our topping, delimbing, and bucking operations. So if you think about it, the way to maximize disturbance and duff layer disturbance is to pull everything out, is to skid tops out and pull tops out and all that kind of thing. And that's going to cause a significant amount of duff disturbance that's going to lead to, you know, maintenance of almost monoculture yellow poplar. So if you want to mitigate that, you do your topping and delimbing at the stump. Now, if you're chainsaw harvesting in these areas, that's not a big thing. You would typically top anyway. So topping and delimbing, though, is important. Bucking where appropriate to minimize cabling and skidding disturbance. So we're assuming you're going to be winching things out of here or cabling things out of here. Adjust your bucking to where you minimize the amount of drags, if you will, or minimize the disturbance. Now, a lot of times, you know, we're wanting to skid lengths greater than 12 or 16 foot, obviously, you know, and that may be a good idea from the standpoint of trying to minimize disturbance to the soil, because that's the less drags that you have to have, okay? Taking pulpwood out of here can increase the disturbance, obviously, and certainly the top removal. And the reason I bring the top removal thing up, you know, from the standpoint of a saw log market, you're going to leave the top in the woods anyhow. But when you start talking about, you know, biomass, for example, and we've had discussions about that, where you're trying to remove a lot of material, including tops, and you're going to be pulling those things out of there, that you're going to have a ton of site disturbance when you do that, okay? And so that disturbed soil obviously can lead to yellow poplar takes advantage of that, of course, okay? And when you're skidding and cabling, a lot of this we'll do, you know, from the constructed roads or constructed skid trails. And so you want to try to keep your equipment on them as best as you can, obviously. And for manual harvesting, maximizing the cable deflection using arches. So for example, you're going to create a lot more disturbance winching with a bulldozer, for example, than you would a cable skidder, because a cable skidder has an arch on it, okay? And so little things like that you can do or think about anyway can minimize disturbance of these sites, and that has an impact on the floristic disturbance, okay? If using mechanized systems, things like shovels where you've got a big reach, swing arm feller bunchers cut the lengths, but particularly shovels with the long reach that they have can definitely help you out at times, okay? And so I'll kind of wrap this up with recommendations, then we'll open it up to questions, because as big as physiographic of region this is, and as much diversity as there is across the landscape, undoubtedly there will be some. So obviously a lot of this is common sense. Positioning roads above the hydrologic network so you don't intersect those, you know, is something that you not want to try to, you know, shoot for if you can, or try to achieve. Obviously staying out of there with the road network at all is the best thing to do. You know, and if we were in a situation where you could skyline or something, you could perch your, you know, you could perch your access system, you know, far away from your drainages and that kind of thing, but that's not always possible. And then make sure with your water control structures, if you do put roads in and that kind of thing, that you place them not so, you have to be concerned about your state mandated BMPs, how far your distance is apart, and all those kind of things. But what you really need to be concerned about is where the ephemeral channel network and the overall hydrologic network is at, and position them in a way to keep that runoff out of them as best you can, okay? Extend SMZ requirements to ephemeral channels is helpful in coves. And we didn't mention, I mentioned this kind of in passing, but the elevated stream crossings is very important, particularly in more mesic coves like what we're talking about here, because you know you have more, you have higher soil water pore pressures. You've got a lot more surface flow going on, and elevated crossings are just a requirement on whether it's streams or ephemeral channels. Minimizing duff layer by focusing on where that topping and delimbing is done at to minimize the dragging of that material over the surface. Try to increase that cable deflection as best you can to get stuff off the ground and the weight off the ground as much as possible. And then obviously using appropriate harvesting equipment, okay? And finally, don't forget about the archaeological and historical sites and our need to protect those. So survey and mark those and include that information in the management planning and any forest operations planning that you have. So those are my my quick run through, and I hope I stayed on time here. And of using this one particular cove example here in the Cumberland Plateau, but I think there's some elements of that hopefully that have some interest to you and are applicable to other areas in the Appalachians.
Great, thank you so much, Jeff. We have a couple questions rolling in. We have time for a few today. So the first one is from Kyle, asking what research has been done on the use of tethered assist in these sites, and would the use of construction mats qualify as an elevated crossing, or do you mean exclusively bridges?
No, any kind of elevated crossing, and we have done research on that quite a bit. So any kind of elevated crossing, whether it's a pole crossing, a culvert, or a bridge, or whatever, a PVC pipe bundle, anything but a ford. And so while bridging is always a little bit better, ford is dramatically worse than anything else you could do. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be a bridge, And the first part of that question he was asking about, I think, research in the tethered assist. And I don't have any experience with that or know about, but there may be somebody in, that might want to chime in on that, but I don't have information on that myself.
Okay, great, thank you. And the next question is from Armin. How do you suggest to deal with non-native invasive species that tend to be very common and abundant in cove sites?
Kill them all. I don't know. So yeah, I mean, and that's we've done a lot of work on forest operations and scout and invasion in this particular area that I was referring to in my slides in my presentation today. And so we've done a lot of work with that as far as the different species and where they're coming, whether it's wind blown or seed dispersed due to whether Japanese stilt grass or something, right, that's coming in on seed on equipment, or bird stuff, wind blown stuff like tree of heaven. So obviously with operations, and we tell this to landowners all the time, you pretty much know where a lot of that's going to occur. So you can scout out whether you've got sources of material like tree of heaven, for example. You try to mitigate any of those you can before you actually start an operation. That's one of the things you can do with the windblown stuff, right? The bird disseminated material is a little tough. Washing equipment, all that kind of thing can help. And then you're going to get it along your skid trail networks and your roads and that kind of thing. And that's where you immediately scout for, as soon as you're done. So you try to mitigate up front. Once they're there, obviously they're tough to deal with. We've got long-term studies now. I say long-term, but 15 years where we're tracking the progression of invasive species through cut areas. And some of them we're finding die out by themselves. You just spend a lot of money if you tried to deal with them up front. And then others, constantly increase in problems. So the best thing I think from the standpoint of operations, if you're going to have an operation area, you need to have that as part of your planning on on where it's going to occur, how to scout for it, and have a plan put in place before you actually do the operation. If it's a wind-blown thing like a tree of heaven, if you can get rid of the mother trees, you can take care of your problem. So sometimes you can do that, and sometimes you can't. UK does not suggest you sneak over the neighbor's line and kill their tree of heaven on their property, although it'd be a good ecological thing to do.
And I think as a follow-up question to that, how long should you wait with a harvest after treating invasive species?
So it would depend, okay, so it would depend upon the species and the longevity of the seed bank. For example, Japanese stilt grass, right? Microstegium, it builds up a seed bank and it's going to stay there for a while. You know, depending on what studies you're looking at, you know, you could have a seed bank there 5 to 7 years afterwards, right? So other species that seed's going to die out really quickly. So it all depends. I don't mean to be flippant with the answer here, but it depends upon the species you're dealing with, right? And basically the seed store that has produced, you know, in that area. That's the way I would go about trying to figure out, you know, when to go ahead and open the stand up, if you will. One of the things we didn't talk about, and I was a little reluctant to, although it's a great topic to talk about, and that is how to rehab some of these sites, particularly if you were taking, if you know you had a cove site, mixed mesophytic, you know, in nature naturally, where you had that Brownian diversity in there, and you've got 100%, well, not 100%, but you got 80% yellow poplar now. How do you get back to that? And that's a great question. And there hasn't been much work done, good hard science on that. We're starting to try mechanisms to do that in a few places, but you know, we don't have enough information to talk about it. But it is something from a sustainable forest management standpoint that you might want to consider.
Great. And the next question we have is from Gregory. It's, do you have any experience with applying a lighter touch, for example, small gaps in group selections in these areas that are located on steeper cable ground, and any advice for laying out these type of units?
Yep, absolutely. We do a lot of it. We just finished a study a year and a half ago where we were looking at the impact of small group openings, a half acre to 1.5 acres in size, which I understand is above what would normally happen with a tree throw. I get that. But so we've done a lot of that small group work. And this particular study that we did that I'm referring to was to improve bat habitat for northern long-eared in Indiana. And so we were looking at different spatial distributions of harvest. So we have a lot of experience with that. Typically, and we've tried laying them out several different ways, and markings, and based on what the kind of loggers could do or what they felt that were most comfortable with. We went in and marked tree. Typically what we do is mark the boundary trees for an opening on both sides, on the outside and the inside both. And then the loggers do pretty good with that. So we do a lot of group openings for the specific reason of trying to generate young age classes, and in this case for the habitats for the bats, which they do use. It is a positive thing from a bat population standpoint and habitat. But we have a lot of experience with that. And there is we don't have time today, but we have a lot of data studies that were put in the early 60s looking at different size of openings and vegetative response in the region. We've done that's been published. We do a lot of work with that, and we're to the point now where we're actually doing expanding gap management, where you put a group opening in and then you subsequently manage the adjacent stand over time as you expand that gap. So there's a lot of information that's on size of openings, as well, and the floristic response. For example, holes of a 50-foot size, you might as well, from a floristic standpoint, you might as well not have done anything. Generally, holes about 150 foot in diameter are what's necessary to get a good diversity established that then you can manage. Economics wise, it doesn't really matter. You're going to take X amount of board footage out of a harvested area or a tract. You're going to do that either selectively harvesting, I'll use that word very, very loosely, or in groups. And as long as you get the board footage out from a cost standpoint, doesn't matter that much.
Great. And before we wrap up, I just want to give some space if anybody else has any other questions to ask Jeff before we head off for the rest of the afternoon.
We've got a couple people on the Zoom that have had lots of experience in this region working with these sites. So anyhow, there's some operationally savvy people listening.
All right, we have one last question. Oh, wait. Never mind. Great. Awesome. Well, thank you, Jeff, for being with us today and giving a great presentation, and you as well, Nick. It was great hearing from you both. And this webinar will be available on the Guild's webinar library. It'll be processed by the end of the week if anyone didn't catch the full thing or want to go back and rewatch and listen to some information. It'll be available, and the link will be sent out by the end of the week. But thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity. I hope that was close to what you wanted. So.